Okay. Hello, everybody. This is Nils Davis, and I am hopefully going to have audio. I started the stream without any audio, so I will edit that out, and you won't even know. So, Nils Davis, again, this is welcome to my YouTube channel. I talk about product management topics and sales and marketing and go to market and business presentation, all kinds of topics like that. A lot of things related to storytelling, actually, as it turns out. And this particular video is about two particular stories that I think product managers should have a lot of control about, or a lot of you should have in your back pocket. And the idea of these stories came to me when I was listening to a podcast called Selling with Social. It's by a guy named Marco something. I don't remember his name. I'll put a link in the show notes. He was interviewing an author named Mark Adams, who's a sales trainer and things, and he just wrote a book called The 7 Stories That All Salespeople Must Know. And he talked about all these stories that you use in selling, and I thought, well, that's very interesting. And the two of them in particular were very much the domain of product management, to be able to find, develop, and give to the salespeople these stories. There's two particular stories that are really product management needs to sort of take ownership and be able to tell very well for various reasons. And so I thought, well, that would be an interesting topic for a talk. So let's just go ahead and do that. So I've talked about storytelling before. I've done a little bit of training on storytelling in some of these videos and some of my podcasts and blog. And storytelling is this really powerful way to connect to people and to create emotional connection and resonance when you're trying to, do any kind of persuasion type of technique. And of course, sales is full of persuasion, as is doing things like trying to sell the executive team perhaps on a new project that you want them to fund, something like that. So storytelling comes into lots and lots of different things in business. And of course, we all enjoy stories. We like going to the movies. And the movies, in some sense, and actually current TV, are the epitome of fantastic storytelling. We're not going to get to that point, but we're going to learn how to do some storytelling that will really enable you to become much more persuasive versus not having good stories. So we use storytelling for selling, we use storytelling for pitching ideas, and we use storytelling for selling ourselves as well. So for example, when you're interviewing for jobs, you're always being asked things like, tell me about a time when you did XYZ, handled a difficult customer, or had to convince somebody to do something they didn't want to do, or showed a time when you were creative. And those all you should answer those in the form of stories. That's the best way to answer those. So what it really is a story? Well, we're going to talk about that in a minute. Let me just first reintroduce myself. I'm Nils Davis. I'm the author of this book, The Secret Product Manager Handbook, a very useful book, particularly if you're just starting out in product management and want to figure out what it's all about. But I think there's actually a lot of value in there for anyone who is doing product management. I am a product manager. That's my day job. I'm also a coach and a consultant, and I do a blog and a podcast and these YouTube videos as well. I have a course coming up on how to make better business presentations, and you can check out all the links in the show notes to get more information on all of that stuff. So we're all familiar with the idea of stories having a beginning, a middle, and end. I think every time I've ever tried to learn how to tell stories better, that's always sort of the first thing that people say. Well, your story needs a beginning, a middle, and an end. And in fact, I find that to be not very valuable information. And so I was really happy when a few years ago I learned what I think is a much better way of thinking about stories. The beginning of a story, and this is a basic story structure that works for a lot of selling situations. It's not going to get you an Oscar. It may not get you onto the TED stage, but it's going to work for a lot of the different types of stories you need to tell in the course of being a business person, whether that's product manager, sales, marketing, something like that. So the beginning of the story is about a problem, or it might be about an opportunity that has not yet been realized. But you can think about it as a problem. There's some problem that exists. And then the second part of the story, the middle, is about what you did or what somebody did to solve the problem or to try to solve the problem. And then the end of the story is what the results of that were. So, for example, here's a very boring story. I was really hungry because I'd skipped lunch. That's my problem. You can tell already this is going to be kind of a boring story. I was really hungry, so I skipped lunch. So I went to the store and I got some salami and some bread, and I came home and I made a sandwich. That's the solution. And then the results were that I was no longer starving because I'd eaten. And I was really happy, and it enabled me to concentrate on the work that I needed to be done, that I needed to do, instead of focusing on being hungry. So that's the results. Not a very interesting story. Now, it could be, we could make that into a much more interesting story. Or, well, I think that specific story, I'm hungry, I went and got some food, I'm no longer hungry, that's never that interesting. It might be that I hadn't eaten for 3 days because I was holed up in a mountain cabin with a broken leg and I was starving. Now that's the beginning of a really good story, potentially. That might make a good movie. So part of what makes a story good is how dire the problem is. And I'll talk a little bit about how to make sure you find the direness of any problem that you might be thinking about making a story about. So that's the basic structure. Beginning is a problem, middle is a solution, the end is some results. This works for most purposes in business storytelling. There's a lot of other variations. There's like 27 different forms of stories and all this stuff, and Joseph Campbell, and all of there's a lot of more to be said about stories, but this will take you a long way if you just start out with this concept. There's one more, a little advanced thing. I'm not going to cover it in this video, but I talk about it in some of my blog posts and other videos. A little variation where during the solution part, you actually find that there's a different problem, and that actually can make your story even better. But we're not going to get into that. This is just simply, there's a problem, I looked for a solution, I tried to find a solution, perhaps I solved the problem, and then I had some results from that. We can call this structure the PSR, for problem solution results. So I am going to switch over to the slideshow here. So this type of story that you're going to be using for sales, there's a couple of things you need to know about using stories in sales. For one thing, it has to be true. Now, it doesn't have to be super literally true, but it has to be directionally true. So for example, I might talk about a customer, I might use a customer story, and I might talk about a particular customer in a particular segment, and I might make it sound like that customer is a giant business in that segment, and maybe they're a small business in that segment. But I'm not going to say they're a giant company. I'm just going to imply that, right? So that's the sort of thing that you might consider, or you might sometimes it's possible to take a story about somebody in one segment and sort of pitch it as being somebody in the client's segment. If you're trying to use these stories to help you sell, you might make that little sort of editing. The other thing that you might do is you might do a little bit of editing on, or wordsmithing, you might think about it as in terms of what the customer actually said. So the customer might have said, I got these great results, but they might not have articulated it very well. And I think it's very reasonable to sort of edit that result, as long as you don't change the meaning, but edit it a little bit so that it sounds a little bit better, so it flows a little bit better. I think that's a very legitimate change, sort of an editorial change to make. It's best if you can use the customer's actual words, but sometimes you have to rework those. And they really are more compelling if they're the actual words, but sometimes those actual words aren't good enough and you need to do some editing. A good story is also, so that's the whole thing about true and what I mean by directionally true. The stories should be emotionally compelling. So again, I was hungry, I was starving, I hadn't eaten in 3 hours, not that emotionally compelling. I was starving because I hadn't eaten in 3 days, that's emotionally compelling. And there's all these different ways that you can find to make the story emotionally compelling, and I'll talk about some of those a little bit later on when we talk about how to improve the stories. The story should be somewhat exciting. Again, my lunch story was kind of boring until it was I hadn't eaten for 3 days, then it becomes a little less boring. And generally speaking, you're not going to go on a big long storytelling thing. You're going to tell a short amount of a story or something like that. So how do you make these things happen for a story like, our customer used our product and got more uptime? Well, I'll do a little example with that toward the end. But that's what you want to think about. So the two stories that I want to talk about particularly tonight, these are the ones that I think are the best for product managers, are the two stories are the what I call the prospect story, and this is a tragedy usually. It doesn't actually have a happy ending, and you use this for various reasons. The most common reason you'd use this is to pitch a new product idea or a new feature idea to your executives to get funding. So this is going to be a tragedy, and I'll talk about what I mean by this being a tragedy in a minute, and I'll give you some structure about what both of these two stories are. The other one is the customer story. And the customer story is a hero's journey. It's the opposite of a tragedy. The customer has great success and things work out really well, and this is because they used our product. And usually you use these for selling. So you might talk to a prospect about a customer story to make them think, oh, my terrible, sad tragedy will be fixed by the thing that fixed the situation for this customer. You can also use them often for addressing objections, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So for both of these stories, they start with a market problem that has significant impact. And what do I mean by that? This is a problem that the prospect or the customer is experiencing. And if you're selling business software, enterprise software, which is what I do, this would be some way that the business is not being effective. Maybe sales are not going well, or maybe they have big turnover on clients, or whatever it might be. So there's some big problem that's causing them a big issue. And so both these stories start the same way, the prospect story and the customer story. And what happens in the prospect story is that they go through a bunch of attempts to find a solution. They try all different things. They maybe try to build a solution. If it's enterprise software, again, often some of the techniques they'll use is they'll try to build a solution. They'll go out in the market to try to buy a solution. Maybe they'll implement a solution that doesn't work. So those are all the types of things. And the results are that they fail to find a solution, and things just keep getting worse and worse, and the situation gets more and more dire. So that's why it's a tragedy, because they don't have a good outcome at the end. And this is why we might use this story if I'm pitching to some executives about creating a solution to these people's problem. I'm going to say, they have tried all these things and there is no good solution out there for them, and I think we can build a solution that will enable them to have success. That's how I use that story, right? I paint this picture of a terrible, dire situation that this potential pool of prospects have, and then I say, we can solve that. So that's how you would use a prospect story. Now the customer story is the opposite. Again, it starts with a problem, perhaps the same problem, because I now have a solution to that problem. The way that I talk about the solution is that they tried lots of different things, building their own solution, buying competitors, and at some point they found us, and suddenly their problem was solved. And then the results are all the good outcomes from getting those results. And those outcomes are business outcomes, like, for example, their revenue might start growing again, or they might have reduced attrition significantly of their customers, whatever it might be. You also want to tie in things like whether the person you sold to maybe got a promotion. And the reason you want to do that is because you want to put emotionally compelling stuff into your story. It turns out that for most people, business results, unless they are incredibly awesome, like a factor of 10, are not that emotionally compelling. What is emotionally compelling is, oh, and our customer got a raise, our customer got a promotion, our customer was recognized for being the most effective sales manager in the company after implementing our software, something like that. And those become emotionally compelling. Now, another piece you're going to want to do, you're going to do the same thing when you're talking about the problem. You're going to talk about how dire the problem is from a business standpoint, but also how dire the problem is from the standpoint of your prospect as a person. They might get fired. They might lose their job. Same thing. They might not make quota. They might not get home to see their kids' baseball games. If our solution is the type of thing that saves a lot of time. It may be that they're spending 47 hours a week creating the TPS reports, and our solution lets them create those in 5 minutes. Suddenly they're able to go home and watch their kid's baseball game, for example. And that is a personally meaningful goal that's emotionally compelling if you're telling a story to someone, and they will glom onto that. So you need to have all these emotionally compelling components as well as business components. Now, one of the things that, if you look at a lot of customer success stories that are like, go to any enterprise software company's website, or most enterprise software, any business product, go to their website and look for their customer success stories. They typically leave out these emotionally compelling pieces from the customer success stories. And the fact is that if they were to include those, the stories would get much better and much more compelling. Instead, they mostly talk about the business results, and it's leaving a lot of value on the floor, in my opinion. And I'm sure that all of these stories have emotionally compelling components, personal goals achieved, but you often don't see them. Anyway, so what do you need to have in order to be effective at creating these stories? Well, first of all, you need to have done market discovery, because you have to have market discovery to tell the prospects, to learn about the prospect's pain, and then to tell that story. So you're going to go out and do market discovery in your market. You're going to talk to people that are suffering from all these different problems. You're going to find out what problems they're suffering from. You're going to write those things down. You're going to, after you hear about the same problem multiple times, you're going to say, oh, there's a significant problem out here in the market. You hopefully will have a lot of quotes from your prospects, the people in the market, about how terrible it is to have this problem, all the things they tried, how often they got to go home and see their kid's baseball game, which would be never, because they spend too much time doing TPS reports, whatever it might be. So you need to do market discovery to find these prospect problems, or the prospect stories, because it's all about what's happening to the prospect. Now, to tell a customer story, you need to have successful customers who have implemented your solution and solved that big problem and have results and got their promotion, as well as having the business results. Now, if you don't have market discovery, you really are going to have a hard time telling these stories, because what you are going to be tempted to do is to make them up. And sometimes that works, but usually it doesn't. It turns out that if you haven't really found a legitimate market problem out in the market, and you're just creating a solution because you think in your brain that this problem must exist, or maybe it's a problem that you perceive or something like that, products that are built on that structure typically fail, almost always. It's very rare that a product conceived in that way succeeds. Sometimes happens, very rare. If you don't have customers yet, you can still kind of make up a customer-like story. Now, you still won't be able to have the emotionally compelling personal results, but you can talk about how the problem will be solved using your solution. And you can you might be able to imply some potential personal results, like this will save you, this will take a process that takes 5 hours to do down to 5 minutes, and that will give you time to do X, Y, and Z. But it's much better to have the actual customer stories. And of course, if your product really does provide that solution, you should be able to get those kinds of stories relatively quickly, and you should always make sure to ask for those. So, and I have a few questions to help do some discovery on this later, but basically, if you have a customer who's successful, you want to say, well, what were your business results? And you also want to ask questions to get at the personal results. How did that make you feel? Did you get a promotion, or did you get any recognition for solving this problem? And so on and so forth. Now, the way that you use these stories, I've kind of talked about this already a little bit. You use the prospect story to pitch new ideas to the executive team. Again, that's going to be a problem with significant impact to the customer. You're going to talk about all the things that they tried and how they were unsuccessful finding a solution. And you're going to then pitch that if we create a solution, we will get the following benefits, or our prospects will get the following benefits, and they will be much happier, and they will we will ride off into the sunset making a lot of money. So that's how you use this prospect story. It's really about pitching the idea of building a solution to a problem that you found in the market. So in fact, you would typically not use this story in selling. Now you'd use some of the components because the components, right, the problem is the same problem that your customers have. But what you're going to use when you're selling is you're going to use the customer success story, because in what happens in the customer success story is this fantastic moment when the customer discovers your solution and then they implement your solution and they have these fantastic results, right? So that's the way that you use this. So this one is really used in a customer situation. Now, you can use variations on these as well for not just for pitching to a prospect. You can use them for handling objections as well. So for example, if the prospect says you're trying to pitch your solution to a prospect and they say, well, you don't have feature X and your competitor has feature X and we really want feature X, then you hopefully have a customer story in your back pocket that says, well, we had a customer, they also wanted feature X and they were disappointed that we didn't have that, but they decided to go with us anyway. And now they're using feature Y on our product, and actually they're super happy. And I just recently talked to them, and they said they don't think there's really any need for feature X because they have feature Y. Some story like that, right? So that's how you might use it to handle a story like this to handle an objection. Now, oftentimes, I have a note here, sometimes the customer success stories are quite long, and there's lots of different components of them. You can use that in various ways. You typically don't want to tell the whole long story all at once. You might want to divide it up into different stories that you use for different times. So that would be the way that you would do that. If you got a lot of good information from a customer who's had lots of different kinds of success with your product, that would be what you'd do. So let me just tie this into, if you're familiar with my book, I have this structure in there that I call the Secret Product Management Framework. Had to remember the name. And the basic idea is that what product management really consists of is three main things. It's finding market problems, finding and validating market problems. In other words, finding problems that people out there in the market have and that are so bad that they're willing to spend money to solve them. So that's essentially what our solutions address. So we find those problems, we then create solutions to those problems, or we work with our development team typically to make the solution. And then we take the solution to market, which means finding other people like the people finding other people that have those problems, letting them know we have a solution, and telling them why our solution is superior to their other alternatives. That's essentially the framework. Find a market problem, create a solution, take the solution to market. I think it's very interesting that the storytelling framework is very similar to this. It starts with a problem, it talks about a solution, and go-to-market is a little bit different than results, but they kind of tie together. And I've got some notation here about sort of how you do these components, right? In market discovery, we learn about the potential problems out there, and we validate that they're terrible. And then when we create the solution, in order to have anybody even decide to work on our solution or to give us funding for it, we have to tell the stories about the problems that we found and how terrible they are and how we can have a big impact by creating a solution. And you use those stories not just actually for your executives to sell the idea of the product, but also with your development team so that they can get engaged in creating it. And oftentimes they'll create a better solution if they really understand the problem, rather than just you tell them, I want this feature, I want that feature. And then finally, marketing and sales use these stories to go to market, both to talk to prospects and as well to talk to customers, and they use these customer stories to sell, and they use the prospect story actually to do marketing, because what they want to do, what marketing really is trying to do is to find other people with these problems. And so they're going to be using the problems that you discovered as part of the prospect story, and they're going to say, hey, people out in the market, if you have this problem, this terrible problem that we know people have, you should come look at our solution because we have solved it, right? So that's how the prospect story plays into that as well. So those are, I don't really have a summary here. those are the stories, the prospect story and the customer story that that product management really needs to be responsible for, and it really is partly because it ties into this structure that I have on the slide here. So, what do you want to do? What's the action that you should take about this? Well, you should be going out and doing market discovery and finding these prospect stories, these terrible stories, these stories about these terrible situations. And of course, as your product rolls out, you want to get your customers to give you feedback on their experiences, and make sure that you're capturing those stories, both the business results as well as the personal results. Now, I did want to talk a little bit about some of the coaching on how to make your stories better. So I mentioned that early on, right? That you want to make the problem really dire. And the fact is that most of us, at least this is my experience, are not that good at recognizing how bad a problem might be. We tend to soft pedal the problem a lot of times. Now, this is true both when we're telling our own stories, like if you go back to that I mentioned when you ask interview questions, tell me about a time, but it also happens in business and customer success stories as well. So we might say, the sales team missed quota a couple quarters, and that sounds sort of, you can infer that could potentially be a big problem, but it's much better when you're telling that particular story is to say something along the lines of, our sales were tanking, and if we didn't fix something, the company was going to go out of business. Well, that is true. I don't even have to make that up. If you miss quota over and over again, if the sales team can't meet quota over and over again, then eventually the result is the company goes out of business because you can't make enough money. And so it's not a lie. It's not, but it is pointing out that, yeah, the outcome of this particular problem is the company goes out of business eventually. Or you lose all your good salespeople. There's all these different things that can happen. Certainly, if you're a sales manager in a company that can't make quota, you're probably going to get fired. That happens well before the company goes out of business. Even if it's not really your fault, even if there's some other reason that you're not making quota, rather than just the fact that you as a sales manager are, maybe it's not you as a sales manager and how well you manage. Maybe there's some other problem that's keeping the company keeping the sales from going up. The point is, you're probably going to get fired. So you can do all kinds of things about that. You can ask these questions when you're discovering these problems, right? Things like, what would have happened if you hadn't solved the problem? Well, if you continue to not make quota, the company goes out of business. Certainly the sales manager gets fired. There's going to be a reorg. A bunch of salespeople are going to leave, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what if it's a different type of problem? Well, you might, for example, what if it's a problem where it's taking 47 hours a week to do the TPS reports? Well, at that point, you can say, well, how much is this costing you? How much is this costing you every week? What are you not getting done? What are the things that are falling off your plate that you need to get done, but you're not getting done because you're spending all your time doing TPS reports? How does that affect your personal life? Do you ever get home? Have you seen your son in the last 5 years? Have you seen your wife in the last 5 years? No, I have to spend 47 hours a week doing TPS reports and then the rest of my job. And so you want to learn about all these potential impacts, both business and personal, because that will help you make the story better. So then, for example, in the TPS report example, I would say something along the lines of, these people spend 47 hours a week working on the TPS reports, and that means that there's a bunch of other stuff that doesn't get done. It's costing them a huge amount. It's costing them, $47,000 a week to do this, and it means that they never get to see their families, and so there's been a bunch of divorces. Whatever. You can obviously, you want to learn what the real aspects of the story are. So, you also can ask questions like, what's the impact of not fixing this problem, right? What is the personal impact on you? What does it mean for your job? You can always ask, when you're doing these types of questions, tell me more about that. Because they might, we're all a little reticent when we're initially asked about things. And so we might just say, well, it takes us a long time to do the TPS reports. And then you want to come back and say, well, tell me more about that. And they might say, well, they might lead down a path that they might start talking about how much they're not getting done elsewhere, or how much they're not getting to see their family, or how much it costs. Or you can ask another leading question. Well, how much time does it take you to do the TPS reports? And so you can follow those types of questions, and you can often find out, if you do that type of questioning, you can find out a lot of really bad stuff. And then what you want to do is you want to combine that into what I call a vertical takeoff, which is like my phrase that I used earlier: sales were tanking. Right? That's, if I miss quota every quarter for 3 quarters, I can say sales were tanking. That's a very attention grabbing phrase, and that's the type of thing that you want to work on. Now, so what do you want to do? How are you going to make use of this? Well, you're going to find that vertical takeoff, as I mentioned. You want to work on getting concrete results. So some level of business results. There's a phrase about persuasion, and since we're using these stories in the persuasion context, there's a rule of thumb about persuasion, or a basic rule of persuasion, which is that people make decisions emotionally, and then they justify them rationally. So that's why you have to have the emotional components. Oh, that person was going to get fired. But you also have to have some level of the business justification for the decision as well. Oh, that saved us $100,000 a year. That's a nice business justification that goes along with, and I got a promotion. So you need to have both of those things in order to make the decisions stick and be justified. So when you find a problem, one of the other things is you're going to ask all these questions about the problem, and like, you're going to find out that, oh, sales are tanking. You're going to find out that somebody was about to get fired. You're going to find out that your customer satisfaction was low, and all these things. When you get to this results part of the story, you want to pay off all of those concerns. So in the problem, it was my sales were tanking. In the results, it was we beat quota by 20% every quarter since then, something like that. If it was I don't get home to see my kid's baseball game, it's I make every baseball game now. If it was I was going to get fired, it's like I got a promotion, I got recognition, something like that. It's really great if you can get an additional payoff as well. Most quantitative results are not that emotionally compelling, so you can use them, but you need to combine them with something else. Some quantitative results are like a factor of 10 improvement in something. So for example, I worked on a product years ago where we reduced the downtime we increased the uptime of Windows servers from 80% to like 99.9%. Easy. We could do that in the first day. Well, that's a 20% improvement in uptime, but it's a factor of 100 improvement in downtime, or reduction in downtime. That's actually emotionally compelling to people. If you say, we basically eliminated downtime, we reduced it by a factor of 100. That actually is pretty compelling to the types of people that buy system management software. They might not be that excited by a 10% reduction in downtime, even though that's their job. But they're very excited by a factor of 100 reduction in downtime. So you want some emotionally grabby results, as I mentioned. And you can also sometimes, to some people, things like we crushed the competitors is an emotionally compelling result as well. So that's it for the video today. A little bit more from me. You can, as I said, there's the book. It's on Kindle and paperback. You can get it on Amazon. I've got a bunch of links below in the show notes. You can follow me on Twitter. I have the blog, the Secret PM product, secretpmhandbook.com/blog. I've got the podcast, alltheresponsibility.com, and you can access this channel if you ever get lost by going to secretpmhandbook.com/YouTube. That's where the channel is. So hopefully this was somewhat interesting, this idea of these 2 stories that product managers need to be able to tell. The prospect story, which is a tragedy, the tragedy of the prospect, and then the not really comedy of the customer, but the glory of the customer story. Anyway, I probably should come up with a phrase for that. I could trademark it. It'd be really good. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. I'll put some links in the show notes. I'll put a link into the podcast on Selling with Social, with the interview with Mark Adams, which I think was really useful. And until the next time, that's it for me. Hope you enjoyed this, and we'll have another podcast or another video next week. Okay, bye-bye.